The space race was one of the most fascinating times in human history, with two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, competing to see who could put man in space and eventually on the moon. Now, of course, we all know that the Soviets were the first to put man in space with Yuri Gagarin in 1961. But was Yuri the first man in space, or just the first to make it back? Today we're going to be talking about the lost cosmonauts. Now, the theory goes that the Soviet Union covered up the deaths of several cosmonauts before Yuri's successful flight in 1961. And while this theory may sound outlandish to some, there's actually more evidence than you might think. For example, in 1959, a Czechoslovakian source leaked information about the Soviets making unannounced attempts to put a man in space. The source alleged that a man named Alexei Ladovsky was the man launched inside a converted R-5A rocket. Now, what is the R-5A, you might ask? Well, it was a converted Cold War-era Russian ballistic missile that was capable of transporting a nuclear warhead. The source also listed 3 other cosmonauts who were alleged to have passed away under similar circumstances, the 3 being Andrei Mitkov, Sergei Shuborin, and Maria Gromova. And later that same year, the Italians would back this up with a similar claim. Also in that same year, a Russian newspaper published an article with pictures of 3 other men, Colonel Pyotr Dolgov, Ivan Kakur, and Alexei Grashkov. Dolgov was reported to have been killed during a high-altitude equipment test after his helmet broke during the jump, and then he passed away after his suit quickly depressurized. And also it appears that around the same time that Dolgov passed away, Ivan simply disappeared, and there was no statement from the Soviets whatsoever about why or what happened. And as for Alexei, I couldn't find much information on him, but he is also believed to have been heavily involved with the group. So then what does this have to do with the lost cosmonauts? Well, in 1959, a Russian journalist suggested that the men had not died during high-altitude tests, but rather during a secret space flight. And also later that year, the same newspaper published a picture of Gennady Zadovsky. Zabadovsky also tested high-altitude equipment and was believed to have likely known Pyotr, Ivan, and Alexei. And later that same year, Zadovsky's name would appear on a list of dead cosmonauts with no date or accident listed. So now this is just a disclaimer. The details of that particular part of this case are still highly debated, as both sides of the argument, both the sides that say it happened and the side that says it never happened, both claim to have multiple sources for their reasoning why it did or did not happen. And I looked through several of those sources. I'm not going to say where I stand on the issue, but that's just a disclaimer that this is still not confirmed. This is just alleged. So now that that's said, let's get into the slightly more hard-to-believe theories. So in 1960, science fiction author Robert A. Heinlein alleged that he was told by Red Army cadets that the Sputnik 1 mission was manned. Now, for those of you who don't know what Sputnik 1 is, it was the first ever satellite to be successfully launched into orbit, and it was a major breakthrough in the space race. Heinlein claimed that he had been told that Sputnik 1 was in fact manned. However, there was a mechanical error making recovery impossible, leading the Soviets to list it and claim that it was actually an unmanned mission, when in reality they were just unable to recover the crew. Now, of course, the Soviets denied this rumor, but at this point the cat was already out of the bag and the speculation continued. Now let's talk about one of the more interesting theories as it pertains to this case, the Torbert recordings. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, were radio operators who claimed to have recorded evidence of several failed Soviet space flights. Now these recordings were reported to be as follows: May 30th, 1960. Unnamed cosmonaut lost when orbiting space capsule veered off course. November 1960. The brothers picked up an SOS message in Morse code from a troubled spacecraft. February of 1961. Recorded the suffocation of a cosmonaut. April of 1961. Just prior to Yuri Gagarin's flight, a capsule circled Earth 3 times before re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. May of 1961. Weak calls for help from an orbiting capsule. October 1961, a Soviet spacecraft veered off course and vanished into deep space. November of 1962, a space capsule bounced off Earth's atmosphere during re-entry and disappeared. May 1963, unnamed female cosmonaut perished on re-entry. April of 1964, cosmonaut lost when capsule burnt up on re-entry. Now, that is one of the most well-known theories, as it is also still highly debated almost 60 years later. And just the fact that they claim to have these recordings is strange, but what gives it validity is these guys were confirmed to have been amateur radio operators, and that's what many people believe, at least, to give their story any credibility whatsoever. Now let's talk about my favorite one of the allegations, the failed Soviet moonshot. Now, we all know that the US won the space race after they put man on the moon during the Apollo 11 mission. However, this theory alleges that as a last-ditch effort to win the space race, the Soviets attempted a secret launch before the Americans. The story goes that just before the Apollo 11 mission, the Soviets attempted to send a manned N-1 rocket to the moon. However, the story goes that it ended in disaster before the rocket even got off the ground, as it exploded on the launch pad, killing the crew inside. However, these reports were debunked after a report came out that revealed that the explosion was simply just the test of another rocket booster. So I'm going to give my thoughts on the whole ordeal. Do I think it happened? Maybe. Now, why do I say maybe? I say maybe because, of course, there is evidence that came out to prove that it did not happen. However, reports are pretty easy to fake, especially when you are the Soviets and you can just make them up. There would be no reason to not do that, especially if it would make you look better, and there would be no repercussions for doing so. And as we all know, the Soviets had no issue lying during that time period, as is shown during the Cold War and other things. But of course, they would never do that. The government would never do anything wrong. They would never do that. Nothing happened at Ruby Ridge. Stop asking. So yeah, that is going to do it for this one. I want to announce that I have my upload schedule picked. It is going to be on Tuesday and Saturday. So 2 videos a week, at least until I have a large project that I'm working on. For example, my Mandela Catalog series, which I don't have a timeline for yet. So I don't know when I'm going to need to take a day off for that. But I promise that if I do take a day off, it will be worth it. And trust me when I say I'm very excited about the Mandela Catalog series, and it will be worth it. So that's about all I have for you again. And I will see you guys on Saturday. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.